The stage is now yours.
Thank you, Rochelle. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who attended. Today we're going to be talking about migrating the ATP to the cloud. And what we mean by this is if you already previously had an ATP or are considering purchasing an ATP firewall, we're going to show you how to manage it or how to put it in the cloud so it can be managed. This webinar, we're now going to cover how to set up the security services. We've done something like this previously for the USG Flex. However, in a future webinar, we will cover some of the newer features that are added for the ATP in the cloud, such as the sandboxing, which differs from the USG Flex. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's look at the agenda for today. It's a very short agenda, mainly because we did cover migrating the USG Flex into the cloud, but there's going to be some differences here because as you see, we also have new support for firewalls, and then we have a new deployment method. So when we get to section number 2, I'm going to cover the old deployment method and then the new deployment method for getting the ATP into the cloud. So let's first start with the new support for our firewalls. So as you can see, we now support all of the models of the ATP. So previously, when we had the USG Flex added to the cloud, it was only the Flex series. But now we support the ATP models, and additionally, we do support the USG 20 VPN. But today we're going to focus on the ATP series. As you know, the ATP series does come bundled with specific licenses. So we have our Gold Security Pack, and then also we have our Trial and our Standard. So when you get your Gold Security Pack, you will have a 30-day trial, and then once that trial expires, it will then kick in the 1-year Standard Security Pack. Now this, for Nebula to have the ATP cloud, you have to have version 5.110 and above for the firmware. So if you are not on that firmware version, you will need to upgrade to that particular minimum firmware version. Now looking at the bundled license, we can take a look and see how they differ from the on-premise or the local managed mode versus the cloud mode. So with the ATP, it's a gold series, a gold service pack that you get. And then with that particular gold service license, you can't pick and choose what services you get. It's an all-in-one bundle. So as you can see here for the regular gold security pack, you get your web filtering, that's going to be your content filtering, your application control, your anti-malware, your IPS, reputation filter, Geo Enforcer. And with Geo Enforcer, we actually removed it from the license. It is now a free service, so that's still there. We have our sandboxing, our email security, our collaborative detection or response, which is our CDR, and then we have our secure Wi-Fi and our Secure Reporter. So those are what you normally get with your security pack, your Gold Security Service license. When you move it over to the cloud, everything migrates over with the exception of your email security. And then you also are given the Nebula Pro Pack and the option for a security profile sync. When you migrate over, you have the trial. If you already, if it's a new device, you'll get the trial for 30 days. And then the full 1 year will kick in after that. So Phase 12 is our newest version of our NCC for our cloud, which was released in October, that supports the ATP series. So there's a question as to what happens to your Gold Security Pack if you've activated it before this changeover happened. Well, basically what it'll do is it'll take the amount that's left on your license, and then it'll apply it to your new cloud license, and then it'll take your Nebula Pro Pack, which gives you all the extra features for Pro Pack, and then it will expire them at the same time. So for instance, if you had 6 months left on your Gold security service and you migrated to the cloud, you will then have your 6 months left over, and your Pro Pack license will then expire within 6 months. So they will co-terminate at the same time. So with your license activation, your device bundle starts activating, and the counter starts counting as soon as the device is added to Nebula for an organization. If you have any add-on licenses, they're going to be counted as soon as they're assigned to a device in Nebula. And as always, the trial license is always activated first. So you may see that you have 30 days, but don't fret. That basically means that the trial is active. Once that trial period has has exhausted, then it will kick in that 1-year license after it's been done. So now we're going to talk about the new deployment methods within Nebula. So if you've done the USG Flex before, you're going to be familiar with something called the zero-touch provisioning. So all of our USG Flexes and ATPs and the USG 20s will use the zero-touch provisioning. So with the zero-touch provisioning, it requires you to basically assign the device to a site using the MAC address and serial number. And then from there, you're going to assign it to, assign it to an organization, then to a site. And then at that point, you have to go through what we call our zero-touch provisioning. So with the zero-touch provisioning, what it does is it takes a file and you have to put it on a USB stick or a hyperlink. And then after you've configured your WAN settings within Nebula, it copies all that information to this hyperlink or a file. And then what you would have to do then is basically reset your device to factory defaults and then run either the USB or run that hyperlink to put the necessary information into the device in order for it to get synced up to the cloud. This is a little bit cumbersome. However, we do have a new option called Nebula Native Mode. So with Nebula Native Mode, this is a new way to deploy your ATP. This is very similar to our Flex series switches and access points. With those particular devices, you don't have to go through the whole ZTP process. All it requires is for you to put the serial number and the MAC address in Nebula, and it'll automatically communicate with that device. Now, there is actually a caveat with this new method, and it requires that you have a ZTP certificate. So older devices, if you have an older ATP, you're not going to have the ZTP certificate. However, if you go through the whole zero-touch provisioning, during that process, it will download the ZTP certificate, and then it will be embedded on the device. So for future deployments, if you decide to go to standalone mode, that ZTP certificate will still remain on the device. However, if you want to go back to Nebula, you won't have to go through the whole zero-touch provisioning method. Now, please be aware that devices that are shipping with the latest firmware of 5.0 and above will have that ZTP certificate. So if you're purchasing a new device, that ZTP certificate should already be installed on there, so you won't have to run through the zero-touch provisioning. So let's talk about the ZTP certificate. Again, only hardware with the ZTP certificate can initiate the Nebula Native Mode. And this means that if you have the ZTP certificate, you don't have to go through the zero-touch provisioning process, which is a bit cumbersome, which I'll go through in just a moment. So newer hardware that comes from the factory with 5.10 should already have the ZTP certificate installed. Older hardware, like if you had an ATP prior to 5.10, will have to get the ZTP certificate doing the zero-touch provisioning. So if you factory default the unit, the ZTP certificate will remain on the device itself, so you don't have to worry about that. So when you factory reset your firewall, you have to factory reset your firewall when you're onboarding your ATP. This is a must-have. And this is because you have to have the device in factory default so that it can communicate with Nebula. During the whole process of onboarding, it knows what the default information is, and that's what it uses to communicate with Nebula in order to pull down your WAN information and all of your settings. So it has to be in default when you're deploying. When the device is in Nebula, you'll be able to log into the local GUI to change the WAN settings and local LAN settings as well. So this is going to be the flow for the ZTP deployment process. So you'll see here that you add a device to the organization, you add it to the site, and then you select the ZTP process. Your device has to already be in factory default settings. So that means that the default password and the default admin account are still there, and you don't have any other settings changed on there. If you do have some settings changed on there, you will have to factory default it by pressing the reset button on the back of the device or the front of the device as well. So once you selected ZTP, you will check your inbox for a URL link or activation file. So it's going to send an email to the account that's registered to my Zyxel with a link in URL that you'll have to copy. And then you'll connect your computer directly to the firewall and run that link. And what it'll do is it will take the information that's embedded in that file that has all the information required to A, put the correct WAN information on your device, and then B, get it connected to Nebula, and then C, download that ZTP certificate. And once that process is finished, you'll be able to manage it through NCC. So let's take a look at how the ZTP deployment goes. So this is very similar to what you would see on your USC Flex. So the first thing you would do is go through and register the MAC address and serial number for your device. So once it's been registered, you then will see it pop up in your deployment mode. So this is new in Nebula Phase 12. So if you go to Firewall Monitor and then go to the Firewall section, there'll be a section up here that says the configuration where a button says ZTP mode. When you select this option, you're going to be given the option to choose your deployment mode. If you do not have the ZTP certificate, if this is a device that you're configuring that previously was in standalone mode and does not have 5.10 to begin with, and it doesn't have that ZTP certificate, the Nebula Native Mode option will be grayed out. So you will not be able to select this option. Your only option will be the Zero Touch Provisioning mode. So in Zero Touch Provisioning mode, you have to configure your WAN, choose who the installer is, and then choose your method of how you want to install it. So for instance, here, we put our information in, we put our WAN type as DHCP, and it's automatically bound to WAN port 2. You then choose how you install it. If you have it sent to an email, you put your email address in. If you want to install it yourself, you'll be given a file in your email that you can put into a USB and then pop that USB directly onto the device. So once you've done that, it basically gives you the steps on how to set it up. You need to make sure that your WAN port is connected into P2 and then your LAN is connected into P4. Once you've done this, you'll get an email from info@nebula.zyxel.com. And in that email, you'll either have a link or you'll have a specific file that you can download to a USB. If you have this link here, you're going to go ahead and copy this to your clipboard and then connect your LAN port to P4 and make sure that your WAN is connected to P2. Make sure your device is factory defaulted back to its regular settings. So you're going to press and hold the reset button for 5 seconds on the device. And then once it's come back up, you're going to go ahead and copy that link into a browser, and then it will go through the whole ZTP process. So here we have P4 connected to a laptop and P2 connected to your WAN port. You're going to access the device on its local LAN port, 192.168.1.1. And then once you've run that link, it'll go through the whole process of getting it up and ready in the cloud. There will be several different checks that it goes through. So it'll check to make sure that it can apply the configuration from the cloud. It'll verify it, and then it'll activate it. And then it'll tell you if the ZTP process has succeeded. If the ZTP process has failed, you'll have to go back and redo the whole process over again. Now, as you can see, this is a very long process. It is a little bit cumbersome, and that's why we have this new mode for native mode. So if you have the ZTP certificate already installed, or you have a device from the factory with 5.10 as the firmware with the ZTP certificate installed, it's a lot more simplified. First, you need to make sure that your device is factory defaulted. So if it already came from the factory, if it already came from where you purchased it from, it's already going to be in factory default settings. As long as you haven't logged in recently to make any changes, it'll be in default. And it should already contain the ZTP certificate. The next thing you'll need to do is add the device to your organization, add it to the site, and then you can select Nebula Native Mode. So when you select Nebula Native Mode, you'll then be able to change, or it'll actually be able to communicate directly with this device. On the local side, you can log into the device and go through a setup menu. You'll have a choice to choose between your Nebula Native Mode or standalone mode. So what you can do is choose the Nebula Native Mode, which gives you a few screens where you can set up the WAN IP address to access the internet, and then you can test your internet connection, and at that point, it'll communicate with the NCC server as long as you've added the device to a site and it's been registered in Nebula. Now, on the flip side, conversely, you can do a static IP address. I know that with our older NSGs, when we were first onboarding NSGs into Nebula, putting a static IP address was a bit of a hassle. But now with Nebula Native Mode, once you've added it to your the device to the organization and to a site, and you've chosen Nebula Native Mode, once you're in the local management, you can then go through the setup of the WAN settings and then select your WAN settings as either static IP address or PPPoE to get online. And then once it goes online, you will be able to connect to Nebula Control Center. So again, you'll just come in here you're selecting your deployment method. If you do have the ZTP certificate, you will be able to select Nebula Native Mode. And again, if you don't have the ZTP certificate, it will recognize based on the information on the MAC address if you have it or not, and then it'll be grayed out. For the local device, like I said, when you log in for your first time, you have two options. On-premise mode is going to be your locally managed when you don't want to manage it in the cloud. And here we have our Nebula mode. So you would select Nebula mode to configure the next screens to get it online through the WAN port. So here's what the local device Nebula mode menu looks like. So this is the initial setup wizard. You can choose your ISP if you have two ISPs or not. You can choose your ISP parameters, and then you can choose your IP address assignment. If you have any VLANs on the device for the WAN interface, you can put that information in here. Then you can connect to the internet. It'll go ahead and configure your settings, and then once it's done, you can do a connection test, making sure that your connection is good and you can get out to the internet. You can also pull up your network tool test where you can do some connectivity checks as well. But once it's configured and it shows that it has been connected to Nebula, you can go directly to the control center. Now, if you need to log back into the device and it has not been connected to NCC, you can input the serial number of a device here as the password if it has not been connected. Now, as far as the local device information, once it is deployed, you have very minimal options of what you can do with the local GUI. So once it's been controlled by Nebula, you can go directly into the local LAN of the device and pull up the local GUI. This gives you the ability to change some basic settings. So you're not going to get the full stack of configuration. You're only going to get the ability to do some basic maintenance and then changing your public IP address on the device itself. Now, when does NCC not let you select the Nebula Native Mode? Again, if you do not have the ZTP, it will not allow you to do Nebula Native Mode. Additionally, depending on your hardware, again, based on the hardware, if you don't have the correct hardware, it will not allow you to do Nebula Native Mode. So if you have newer hardware, again, from the factory, you will be able to select this. But if you have older hardware, if you purchased it months ago, like an ATP 100 a couple months back, you will not be able to do the native mode until you've ran the whole ZTP process. And finally, how would you verify that you have a ZTP certificate? Well, you can go into the CLI. The only option that you have is basically going into the CLI and running this particular command, show native mode cert file status. So if the ZTP file exists, the certificate, it will tell you yes or no. So if you want to find out if you have that ZTP certificate, let's just say that you purchased a ATP 100 or ATP 200 recently, and you want to find out if it has that certificate, you can run this command and it will tell you right away. So that's basically the gist of how you get the ATP into the cloud. Again, it's very similar to the USG Flex. If you happen to purchase a newer hardware unit with the ZTP, you'll find that it is a lot more easier to get it onboarded into the cloud. Now, as far as configuring all the services, again, we will be doing a webinar. Most likely it will be the next month's webinar to kind of go over some of the new features, specifically the sandboxing and the DNS reporting for the DNS filter, which is new as part of the security services in the cloud. While those existed in standalone mode, there's some differences between Flex and the ATP for your security services, where the ATP has a little bit more in terms of security services over the USG Flex. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for a Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. That was a short but sweet, informative webinar. So for question, we have the first one. Are there any plans to add regions to geo IP objects for security policies in Nebula? This a follow-up question to that is, would make things easier as it seems we can only add 8 countries or objects to each role.
Yes, that's a question that's come up quite a few times talking to some of our customers. I do know that they are going to enhance that in the future. I don't have a date as to when that'll be implemented, but that is on the roadmap, something that they're looking into. I know that putting in a specific region or country, that's great, but it's better to have specific objects bound to the GeoIP itself rather than full countries themselves. But that's something that they're looking into.
Great. All right. For the next question, what is the security profile sync?
Security profile sync is a new option in Nebula that allows you to take a specific site. So let's just say that you have 3 or 4 sites, or maybe you just set up one specific site, and then you got an ATP on there in the cloud already. You already set up a security profile for, say, your content filtering and your IDP. All your whole security stack has been configured already. Now you're onboarding another ATP or USG Flex, and this is for the same company under the same organization. You want them to have the exact same rules for the security as the one that you just configured. So security profile sync allows you to select a specific site and copy and clone the security settings to that new site, and then any change you make on the original site will sync over to the new site. So for instance, you have site A and site B. Site A has security profile has been synced to site B. And then let's just say that the owner comes to you and says, well, we want to add this new security policy. We want to block Facebook. Well, you can go to site A and make that change to add to block Facebook, or use App Patrol to block Facebook. And then it will pull that configuration and sync it to site B. So security profile sync is a great feature if you want to be able to sync the same policies across multiple sites.
Awesome. All right, for the next question, Marcus, if you set up in standalone and move to cloud, then back to standalone, how does that impact a year license that it came with originally?
Yeah, so if you decide to go back from cloud to standalone, it keeps that information in the cloud, but it also syncs it with my Zyxel. So it will carry it back and forth. So if you go from one to the other, the licenses will transfer. So if you have 6 months left in the cloud and you go back to standalone, you should still have 6 months in standalone mode. So it retains that information because it keeps it in sync with my Zyxel, because there's 2 different services here. We have my Zyxel and then we have the cloud, and they're constantly talking to each other. So they'll be able to pull that information if you go from one service to another.
Great. All right. Next question. If internet goes down for a client, can we access our device locally via IP address to make any changes if the device is controlled by Nebula?
Unfortunately, no, at this time you cannot, because what you have in the cloud, let's just say that your internet goes down, your internet's out. You won't be able to access the cloud function because it, any change you make in the cloud, it sends that configuration change to the device over the WAN port. Now, your device will still function because it's going to hold and retain whatever configuration it had before the internet went out. So if you have VLANs, if you have local devices that need to talk to each other, they'll still be able to, but you just won't be able to make changes outside of changing the WAN port on the device. So if your internet goes down and you want to check to see maybe something's wrong with your IP address on your WAN, you can log into the local GUI to make changes to your WAN port, but you won't be able to make the full stack of system-wide changes. But that really shouldn't hinder you from having any productivity issues locally, because it doesn't require a sync to the internet for the device to function. You know, any change you make in Nebula, it downloads that configuration to the firewall and it retains that configuration on the device itself. So if you lose internet access or if Nebula is unavailable, you just won't be able to access the device through Nebula. but the device will still continue to operate under normal circumstances. So if you lose internet access, it'll be very similar to having a basic firewall or router that has lost internet access. Everything locally will still function. So if you have customers that need to print locally, they'll still be able to print. It won't hinder that type of service for local traffic. They just won't be able to go online.
Great. All right. Next question. Just to clarify, if you have an existing standalone ATP and you download firmware 5.10, will it get the necessary certificate to do a native Nebula migration?
No, that's because the firmware 5.10, what they've done is on 5.10 from the factory, they installed a certificate from the factory. It doesn't include the certificate in the firmware. So if you're coming from a like 4.6 or 5.0 firmware, you upgrade to 5.10, you have to go through the ZTP process in order to get that ZTP certificate. Once that certificate's already on there, what you do in the future, if you move it back to standalone mode and then decide later on you want to put it in cloud, you won't have to go through the ZTP process again. So if you want to make sure that you have the ZTP, if you purchased one recently, like if you purchased a device recently, you can run that command that I showed you on the previous slide. In fact, I'll go back to bring it back up here. Here we go. So show native mode cert file status. So if you want to run that command, it'll tell you if you have the ZTP certificate or not. And this is only going to apply to newer devices. So if you've purchased one and you find that it has 5.10, the chances of you having that ZTP file is very, very high. I have been told that all devices shipping starting in 2022 will have it automatically on there. We've seen some that have come in that already have it on there as well. So you want to double check using this particular command.
All right. We have a very interactive audience today. Is a public IP static required for Nebula? Follow-up question to that. If failover was not a public IP, will routers still register to Nebula?
Yeah, so you can use either DHCP or a public IP address for Nebula. If that's what you're talking about. You're talking about static versus a DHCP from the ISP. You can use either or. When you're going through the setup process, it does give you the option if you're doing ZTP or if you're going through the setup wizard, it gives you the option to choose what type of connection, either PPPoE or Ethernet, and then you can assign yourself a public IP address or do DHCP. So as long as you have access to the internet, it will pull that information. So it's not required. Now, can you explain a little bit more about the failover? I didn't quite understand the question. So if you could elaborate on that, and we'll come back to you once you've elaborated on that.
All right. Next question, Marcus. Other than the CLI, is there any other indications that the firewall has this ZTP certificate?
The ZTP certificate, that command line is going to be your best bet. When you go through the onboarding process, the Nebula will actually tell you in the GUI if you can. So if you can do Nebula mode, Nebula Native Mode, if that option is not grayed out, then you will be able to do it. It means that you have the ZTP certificate. But if you want to know definitively ahead of time, just run that command and you'll know if you have the certificate or not. And again, this is only going to apply to devices that are shipping with 5.1.0. So again, if you purchase a device from distribution or you picked it up somewhere and you logged in and it's straight from the factory, you log in, it's got 5.1.0, then run that command just to be certain you'll be able to find out if it has the certificate or not.
Okay, great answer. Why is email security included in standalone but not in Nebula?
Oh, that's a great question. Email security was something that was just recently added in standalone mode. And email security is something that we've done that is different from your normal email security. So if you've used our firewalls in the past, you'll know that we have an option to scan email using signatures based on reputation if you are running a locally hosted mail server. This is a very archaic thing because now a lot of people have moved over to cloud-based email. So there's very, very few people who are running local email servers anymore. Everything's cloud-based. So that option is no longer really valid. We now have a new option in our firewalls for email security where you can actually scan emails for cloud-based email services. Since this is a new implementation, they have not yet ported over Nebula yet. So while it is available in standalone, that option is not available in Nebula as of yet, but it will be sometime in the future.
Okay, there's a follow-up question from the previous question. If primary was public and secondary was not, will it still register back to Nebula during failover on secondary?
If you're doing the setup process, it shouldn't matter. If the device is already in Nebula, you can fail over to either WAN link. So it shouldn't really matter. But the main thing is, though, you have to have, when you're doing the setup process, though, let me take that back. When you're doing the setup process, it has to be through P2. P2 has to be your initiating WAN when setting it up. So during the onboarding process, if you do have a dual WAN, if your WAN connection goes down during the process, you're likely going to get that the ZTP failed. So if you're going through that whole ZTP process. So if your ZTP fails, you have to restart the whole process over if your WAN decides to go down. But the ZTP process is fairly quick. It usually, when you're doing the activation, it shouldn't take any more than 3 to 4 minutes. But it's going to pull that information directly off P2. So while you're doing the setup, having a dual WAN really doesn't do you any good because it's only going to push traffic out P2 to the registration. However, once it's been registered in Nebula and it's been onboarded, you can have a dual WAN and it's not going to have any effect on the actual device itself. You can do load balancing with the dual WAN in Nebula.
Great. And that was the last question, Marcus.
All right.
Do you have any other stuff to add? Anything else to add?
At this time, no. Just I hope that you guys enjoyed this webinar. We're going to be covering the security options, the new security options for the ATP, specifically the sandboxing and the DNS filtering option that's within Nebula, which is different from the USG Flex. If you guys have any other further questions, you can email me directly. My email here is marcush@zyxel.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Or if you have any suggestions for future webinars that you may be interested in, please go ahead and drop me a line. I'll go ahead and respond to anything that comes in. I would appreciate the feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. That wraps up our webinar for today. Thank you again to all attendees, all the questions, and Marcus for an informative webinar. Also, our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 18th, with Sean Rogers, first full stack cloud networking. And also don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Zyxel US channel. I guess that would be it. Thank you guys and have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.